She was a fierce Celtic warrior who led a rebellion that shook the mighty Roman Empire to its core. This warrior was a force to be reckoned with, determined to protect her people from Roman oppression. She nearly toppled one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen, and her name still echoes through the halls of British history as a legendary hero. This is the fierce Celtic Queen Boudica. The Celts, Boudica's people, were a collection of tribes spread across what we now call the United Kingdom, each with its own customs, languages, and traditions. According to the Romans, the Celts fought in a wild, fearsome manner, their bodies covered in intricate painted designs. The Romans called them Picts, or the Painted People, for this reason. In battle, they were terrifying, grunting like beasts and blowing horns that sent shivers down their enemies' spines. They believed a man's head held his soul and power, and so they took their enemies' heads without hesitation. Yet, for all their ferocity, the Celts were anything but savages. They were innovators, the first to invent chainmail armor, which gave them protection in battle, and they crafted gold jewelry with intricate designs. Even paved roads, something the Romans would later claim credit for, were a Celtic invention. Though the Romans painted them as wild and brutal, the Celts were a complex and intelligent society. Boudica herself was queen of the Iceni tribe, alongside her husband, King Prasutagus. They ruled over their people in what is now Norfolk and Suffolk, living in peace for a time. But Boudica's story, like that of her people, is far more than what the Romans could ever capture. She was a warrior, a leader, and a symbol of resistance, whose name still inspires courage today. Cassius Dio, a Roman statesman and historian, paints a vivid picture of Boudica. He describes her as towering in stature, with a most terrifying presence. Her gaze was fierce, and her voice harsh. A great mass of wild, tawny hair cascaded down to her hips, while a large golden necklace adorned her neck, catching the light of the battlefield. Though Dio's words often lacked kindness, he remarked she possessed more intelligence than what he believed often belongs to women. Even he couldn't deny Boudica's brilliance and power. She wore a tunic of many colors, fastened with a brooch beneath a thick mantle, resembling the revered druids of Celtic society, who held intellectual, almost mystical roles within their tribes. These druids, often women, were not only spiritual leaders, but also healers, scientists, and philosophers. It's possible that Boudica herself, remembered for her sharp mind, might have walked among them, further earning her respect and solidifying her leadership. But as Rome's shadow loomed larger, Boudica's focus turned entirely to defending her people. In 43 AD, Rome's legions marched into southern England, marking the beginning of a tense, uneasy peace. Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus of the Iceni, recognized that his warriors were no match for the disciplined might of the Roman army. Reluctantly, he called off their rebellion and sought a fragile alliance with the empire. He believed that surrendering to Roman rule after his death would protect his people. His final testament was a delicate balance. His lands were to be divided between his two daughters and the Roman emperor, a compromise he thought would bring peace. The Romans even extended a loan of 40 million sesterces to help the Britons integrate into the Roman economy, though the burden of repayment, with interest, weighed heavily on the Iceni. The Celts, who were rich in gold and resources, had never sought such a loan, but it seemed the only way to survive under the Romans' rule. In 54 AD, a new ruler sat upon the throne of Rome, Nero, a 16-year-old emperor known for his extravagant spending. As the empire's coffers dwindled, he sought to reclaim lost fortunes through taxes and debts, eager to enforce the repayment of loans on conquered lands. To tighten Rome's grip on Britain, Nero appointed Suetonius Paulinus as governor and general of the Roman forces. By 60 AD, King Prasutagus had passed away, and Boudica, his fierce queen, ascended as the rightful leader of the Iceni tribe. But the Romans, with their iron rule and patriarchal mindset, refused to acknowledge her authority. To them, Boudica was just a woman, a fact that would soon come back to haunt them. Before King Prasutagus' death, agreements had been made that should have ensured the safety of his people. But the Romans, led by General Paulinus, had no intention of honoring those promises. Seizing the opportunity, Paulinus demanded immediate repayment of the entire 40 million sesterces loan, plus interest, a debt impossible for the Iceni to pay at once. Using this as an excuse, the Romans stormed into Iceni lands, raiding homes, taking anything of value, enslaving men, and violating the women. No one was spared, not even Boudica's daughters, who were brutally assaulted by Roman soldiers. When Boudica tried to save her children, she was seized, stripped, and beaten in front of her people. Bound by her husband's agreement with Rome, the Celts were forced to watch, helpless, as their queen was humiliated. But Boudica, though beaten, was far from broken. Instead, this savage attack ignited a fierce flame of revenge within her. She wasted no time wallowing in despair. Instead, she summoned the leaders of the nearby tribes. As they gathered, Boudica learned they had all suffered similar atrocities at the hands of the Romans. Fury simmered in every heart, and for the first time, these Celtic tribes put aside their rivalries, uniting under Boudica's leadership. The message was clear: if they wanted freedom from Rome's iron grip, they would have to fight for it. And so began Boudica's rebellion. She had seen her husband's defeat against the Romans years earlier, but now she was ready to lead her people into battle once more. Armed with her sword and standing tall in her horse-drawn chariot, she faced her Celtic warriors, her face likely adorned with the same war paint as her men. In this rebellion, there was no distinction between men and women. Everyone was prepared to fight, driven by a shared thirst for vengeance. Boudica's first target was Camulodunum, the Roman city known today as Colchester. She waited until General Paulinus had left, leading his troops on a campaign to capture Anglesey, an island in Wales. With the city left virtually defenseless, Boudica and her army swept in, slaughtering every Roman they could find. When news of the attack reached Roman officials, they grossly underestimated Boudica, dismissing her as just a rebellious woman. They sent a pitiful force of 200 unarmed slaves to quell the uprising, hardly a match for her growing army of 120,000 furious Celts. When an additional 2,500 Roman soldiers arrived, they too found themselves overwhelmed. The Roman forces tried to protect the citizens by barricading themselves inside the temple of Claudius. But Boudica's army had no intention of waiting for their surrender. Growing impatient, the Celts set fire to the temple, trapping and killing everyone inside. Boudica's rebellion had begun in blood and flames, and the Romans would soon realize just how wrong they had been to underestimate the warrior queen. When General Paulinus finally returned to Camulodunum, he was met with a scene of utter devastation. The temple lay in ruins, reduced to a smoldering heap of ash, while the ground was littered with the remains of beheaded men and dismembered bodies. Blood pooled across the streets, a grim testament to the ferocity of Boudica's rebellion. With only 5,000 men at his command, Paulinus knew he stood no chance against her swelling army. His only option was to ride to the remaining Roman strongholds, trying to evacuate as many civilians as possible before Boudica's forces arrived. Historian Cassius Dio noted the sting of Roman shame, writing, "All this ruin was brought upon the Romans by a woman." The next target in Boudica's fiery path was Londinium, modern-day London. She and her warriors burned the city to the ground, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins in their wake. Along the way, tribal men who had been enslaved by the Romans were liberated and eagerly joined Boudica's ranks, swelling her forces to an unprecedented 230,000. The rebellion's momentum was unstoppable as they sacked Verulamium, today's St. Albans, slaughtering between 70,000 and 80,000 Roman civilians. Roman records describe the Celtic onslaught as barbaric and savage, their accounts dripping with the horror of massacre. After all, it was the Romans who had initiated the violence, pillaging, and raping the Celtic people in the first place. The rebellion wasn't an act of senseless brutality, it was a fight for independence, and Boudica's forces were reclaiming what had been stolen from them. As the Celts surged forward, Rome began to tremble. Emperor Nero, hearing of the thousands dead and the cities laid to waste, seriously considered withdrawing his troops from Britain altogether. Boudica's rebellion was more than just a thorn in Rome's side, it had the potential to topple the mighty empire itself. If Boudica succeeded, she would go down in history as the queen who united the Celtic tribes and won their freedom from Roman oppression. But General Paulinus was not ready to give up. Despite the odds, he believed he could outsmart Boudica and crush the resistance once and for all. He convinced Nero to hold his ground, confident in a strategy that would turn the tide of war. The final showdown came to be known as the Battle of Watling Street. Paulinus chose the battlefield carefully. The two armies met on a Roman road, the famous Watling Street, though the exact location remains disputed among historians. Paulinus had selected the site for its strategic advantage. A dense forest guarded the Romans' rear, ensuring they could not be attacked from behind. The wide open field in front of the forest left Boudica's forces with only one option: charge head-on into the Roman lines. It was a perfect setup for the decisive battle that would determine the fate of Britain. General Paulinus, facing the might of Boudica's vast army, had only 5,000 soldiers at his command. Realizing the dire odds, he sent urgent letters to retired Roman veterans scattered across Britain. These men, though older and enjoying their peaceful lives, still held a fierce loyalty to the empire. Paulinus managed to rally another 5,000 troops, bringing his army to 10,000. Even with reinforcements, they were still hopelessly outnumbered by Boudica's enormous force. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, Boudica delivered a rousing speech before the battle, and her troops followed her wholeheartedly. 100,000 warriors rallied behind her and trusted her leadership. Armed with weapons scavenged from the Roman cities they had conquered, Boudica's army was still not as well equipped as their Roman foes. The Roman soldiers wore full suits of armor, their heads protected by helmets, and their feet clad in sandals embedded with nails to give them better grip on the battlefield. They wielded swords, large shields, and long spears, which could be thrown from a distance to avoid close combat. Despite this technological edge, Boudica's forces brimmed with confidence. They were so certain of victory that they brought their wives and children along, positioning their wagon trains in a semicircle behind the battlefield, effectively sealing their own escape route. They intended to win or die. As Boudica's massive army stood ready, Paulinus saw the fear in his soldiers' eyes. Staring down a force 10 times larger than theirs, his men were understandably terrified. But Paulinus had a tactic for that too. He insulted the Celts, mocking them as savages, and pointed to the female warriors as proof of their supposed weakness. He barked at his men, trying to snap them out of their fear, and roused their spirits with cutting remarks about the enemy. Paulinus understood that although he had fewer men, their technology gave them the upper hand. His soldiers stood side by side, shields raised in a wall of iron. When the Celts charged, the Romans hurled their spears into the sky. With no heavy armor to protect them, Celtic warriors fell as the spears tore through their chainmail and unprotected bodies. Boudica ordered her forces to fall back and try again, but each time they clashed with the Roman shield wall, they were met with sharp Roman swords. Every few minutes, the Romans rotated, allowing fresh soldiers to move to the front, ensuring no man grew too weary to fight. As the battle wore on, the Celts began to tire. Then Paulinus made his final move. He ordered his men to form a wedge, a powerful triangular formation that surged forward, cutting through the Celtic ranks. Boudica's army, now exhausted and facing this formidable metallic force, began to retreat, only to find their escape blocked by their own wagons. It was a massacre. According to Dio, the remainder took to flight, although escape was difficult, as the cordon of wagons had blocked the outlets. The troops gave no quarter, even to the women. The baggage animals themselves had been speared and added to the pile of bodies. Roman records claim that 80,000 Celts, men, women, and children, were slaughtered at Watling Street, while only 400 Romans fell. After the crushing defeat, Boudica fled. While her ultimate fate remains a mystery, the historian Tacitus speculated that she might have taken her own life, following the Celtic tradition of choosing death over dishonor. Cassius Dio, on the other hand, suggested that she later succumbed to illness. Either way, Boudica's story faded into obscurity for many years. It was an embarrassing chapter in Rome's history, and so it was conveniently forgotten. But during the Renaissance, her tale of courage and defiance resurfaced, and the legacy of the warrior queen who fought for her people's freedom began to inspire once again. Boudica may have fought a losing battle, but her courage and determination made her a true hero, remembered not just for her rebellion, but for embodying the unyielding spirit of resistance.